Chapter 17. The Reaper Makes His Move. The following weekend, it was time for the Dueling Hearts' much-discussed teams match at the Mega Dojo. Now that the team had so many relief members, it wasn't even really necessary for Jo herself to be there, but because of how much she had been looking forward to the fight, she insisted on competing herself. In the end, the lineup for the match ended up being Jo, of course, Tucker, Rocky, and, of all people, Lawrence. He had actually volunteered to compete, though Jo suspected that he'd done so at Karen's request, hoping that working together with his new allies would help them build a rapport. Jo appreciated it either way, and was looking forward to seeing Lawrence in action when he wasn't a threat to her or her friends. Jo woke up in a better mood than usual. She hadn't had any nightmares, that she could remember at least, for a couple of nights, and her mom was coming to watch the match. That latter fact excited her, and not just because it meant that she wouldn't have to take the bus, though that admittedly was a factor. It gave her time to take the morning slow and enjoy herself. She had also been practicing the soul shear, both with Wilson and on her own, and she felt that she'd made some progress. Everything was coming up Jo. Even the imposing threat of the Reaper's return, undoubtedly closer now than it had ever been, wasn't enough to spoil her mood or her excitement for the heart-to-heart to come. Jo rode happily in the back seat of her mom's car, wrapping her hands in preparation for the fight, looking forward to the thrill that only a good physical competition can bring. From the driver's seat, Shannon was just as excited for her daughter. She was far more aware of the true dangers that Jo and the other Dueling Hearts were facing than she felt comfortable letting on, but she was confident that this dangerous time would pass. She knew of Jo's dream to fight professionally, and she knew that doing well under contract with Prometheus Corporation would help her reach that goal more easily. If ProCorp decided to sponsor one or more teams permanently, if the Dueling Hearts ended up being one of those teams, it might even lead to a permanent partnership with that hugely successful company. Still thinking fondly about her daughter's future, Shannon pulled up to the curb in front of the Mega Dojo and let Jo out. Then she pulled away from the curb again and drove slowly through the lot looking for a place to park. It didn't take long, and she jumped out of her car quickly, anxious to head inside before the fight started. But before she could, she hesitated. To an onlooker, she would have appeared to have noticed something intriguing in the distance. She turned away from the Mega Dojo's facade, directing her attention toward a grouping of trees across the road. Suddenly she was gone, appearing beside that road, bypassing it entirely with a jump and a swift application of her soul. She crossed the tree line at a more natural pace a moment later. Before long, Shannon arrived at her destination. She hadn't been sure exactly where she was going, but she had an idea what she would find there, and she recognized the place once she arrived, taking in the disheveled appearance of the forest clearing. This must be where he fought them, she thought, remembering the painful details of a story that she had been told in secret only a few days ago, starring her two girls. The clearing floor was trampled flat, save for the areas that had been dug out by, Shannon assumed, one of Sarah's techniques. Scanning the dirt closely, Shannon could see dried blood in a few places, blood that almost definitely belonged to Jo. She attributed the nearby row of felled trees to Jo as well. Shannon took a deep breath, calming herself. She'd been presented with a unique opportunity here, and she didn't intend to waste it by driving her opponent away prematurely. "I know you're here," she said to the seemingly empty clearing, "and I get the feeling that you were counting on that. So just get it over with. Show yourself and tell me what you want." The shadows in the darkest, densest part of the clearing, the area across the clearing from where Shannon stood, began to churn. Shannon noticed for the first time now that that darkness had not been natural, but a thick, dark, shadowy smoke. Out of the smoke stepped a scrawny young man wearing a dirty, tattered, oversized dark hoodie, the hood up, shrouding his face in a shadow that was just as unnatural as that darkness had been. He perfectly fit the second-hand description that Shannon had got from Wilson, and so she recognized him right away. "I was hoping that I'd run into you at some point," she told this new arrival, her lips curling into something resembling a snarl as she capped her sentence with, "Reaper." "I have to say," the Reaper replied, "I'm impressed. I had planned to get the jump on you on your way into that abomination of a dojo. I've heard that you're strong, but I didn't expect you to be able to sense my approach. I'm also a little surprised that you know who I am. I was under the impression that Jo and Sarah didn't intend to tell you about their encounters with me." "There are a lot of things about me that would surprise you," Shannon replied. The Reaper ignored her, pacing a bit as he said, "It doesn't matter. I need to limit the ability of your daughters and their friends to act, and even if you're more aware than I expected, you're still the best option I have for leverage. Strong as you may be," he reasoned, "your advancing age combined with a lack of recent heart-to-heart experience makes you the weakest member of your daughter's immediate family. They won't want to risk attacking me all out while your safety is uncertain, and they will ensure that none of their allies do either." "I guess that explains why you're so comfortable telling me all of this," Shannon remarked. "You think you'll be able to defeat me easily before I have a chance to get away. Has anyone ever advised you to check your arrogance? You've issued a challenge against a master. I promise you, this won't go the way you think. At this point, the intentions of both fighters were absolutely clear, their combined energies sparking between them. They could feel the area all around them filling with their clashing soul, signifying that their heart-to-heart had already begun. Shannon stood her ground as her opponent circled her slowly, assessing her. She was careful not to show her hand. If her opponent wanted to make the mistake of thinking she was weak enough to be a pawn in his plans, then she intended to use that to her advantage. She consciously held as much of her soul back as possible, making it practically impossible to pin down the general range of her abilities. Meanwhile, she reached out with her senses to assess the Reaper. She perceived a huge well of potential within him, but nothing she felt she had to worry about. After a little while longer, staring each other down, the Reaper finally decided to make his move. He placed his hands nonchalantly into the pouch in the front of his sweatshirt, but Shannon knew what that meant. She'd only learned about the Reaper's abilities from someone who had, likewise, only heard a description of them, but it had been a good description. Shannon smirked a smirk that would have made her daughters proud and sent soul into her hands just as the Reaper snapped his hands back out of his pockets, holding half a dozen knives between the fingers of each. His hands moved like a blur, slinging the knives at Shannon like bullets from a gun, and yet Shannon didn't even flinch. In the fraction of a second that it took the knives to reach her, she lashed out 12 times with the fingers of her two hands, knocking the knives away, leaving herself completely unharmed. When the knives didn't fall to the ground and instead turned in midair and surged toward Shannon again from every side, she was more amused than surprised. They had been carved specifically to hide the fact, but the knives were made of bone, hardened with soul until they resembled steel. Being organic material, the Reaper could put his soul into the weapons and control them freely until that soul was expended, but to Shannon it didn't matter. After all, if the knives couldn't move, then it didn't matter anymore who had control of them. With a series of subtle gestures, Shannon conjured little white discs around each blade, snagging them in midair and holding them firmly in place. In the time that it took for Shannon to summon her little barriers, the Reaper surged forward. He moved with incredible speed, leaving a puff of smoke behind him. His technique reminded Shannon of Joe's shadow step. To most fighters, his approach would have seemed practically instantaneous, but Shannon's eyes were sharper than that. She was able to track her opponent's movements well enough to anticipate where and how he would attack. Without even turning, she reached back over her shoulder and blocked her opponent's raised fist. Then she swung her elbow back and drove it into his chest, knocking him away and off balance. Seizing her advantage, Shannon gestured again and a much larger white circle of light appeared in front of her. She jumped up and kicked off of that barrier, turning in midair as she launched herself higher. She swung her arm like a hammer, putting her full weight behind it, bringing it down toward the Reaper's head. He managed to sidestep the devastating attack at the very last moment, but Shannon called another barrier into existence behind him, boxing him in before he could retreat any further. She spun on her heel, launching a full-force knee strike at her opponent's chest. He slung his arms into the path for attack, absorbing as much of the damage as he could, but he was still knocked backward and crashed through Shannon's barrier, shattering it like glass. The Reaper staggered and then stepped back from Shannon, using his smoke step again, darting randomly around the clearing, leaving behind the impression that he was in many places at once. As he did, he left more and more smoke in his wake until a huge amount of it was left ringing the entire area, rolling between the trees. Shannon made note of the smoke, but kept her attention on more immediate concerns. Her opponent launched himself toward her, seeming to approach from multiple directions at once. Bracing herself, Shannon made quick note of what she was wearing, a blouse and long skirt. She reached out without looking and grabbed one of the Reaper's knives, the barrier holding it in place dissolving at her touch, and she sliced down the length of her skirt, freeing up her movements in time for her to dance nimbly out of the path of all of her opponent's potential strikes. Finally, Shannon hopped casually several feet into the air. She flipped and turned midair, throwing her opponent's knife back at him just as he appeared with his knee thrust at where she had just been. He had just enough time to pull another knife from his pocket, deflecting the first with a sharp, jerking motion. He planted both feet firmly on the ground, his hands falling heavily to his sides, his knife still in hand, and he looked Shannon over again. Even though she couldn't see his face, she could sense his renewed interest. "There's no point in trying to hide it anymore," the Reaper said frankly. "I can tell without having used my sixth sense that you're much more powerful than you seem. Much more powerful than I would have guessed. I'm genuinely impressed that you were able to output enough soul to counter every one of my attacks while still managing to suppress your full potential." "I'm flattered," Shannon snarked. "The fact of the matter is," the Reaper continued, ignoring her, "you are a variable that I couldn't have foreseen, but I simply don't have time anymore to reevaluate my plans. Either I'll be able to capture you and use you for your intended purpose, or my mission will fail. There is no third option anymore. So what do you say we set aside all pretenses and give this our best?" The Reaper gasped. He clearly had more to say, but he was hindered by the long, thin, ultra-sharp, glassy white blade which had suddenly emerged into existence, springing from a flash of light in the ground below him, reaching up and piercing him through the torso. Shannon had taken him up on his offer and, with a simple gesture of her index and ring fingers, had called the 6-foot-long shaft of solid soul into existence, intersecting her opponent's body, cutting through it effortlessly. Stunned, the Reaper utilized another technique that Shannon had heard about, turning completely to smoke and launching his mass some distance away from where he'd just been, before reforming. This was of interest to Shannon, as this had been the one technique that she hadn't gotten a clear picture of from what she'd been told. Transforming into a gas or an element wasn't unheard of, but Shannon wondered what utility this technique had. Could it heal him, and how invulnerable did it make him? Seeking answers, Shannon created another of her blades, spawning this one from the trunk of a nearby tree. It pierced the smoky form of her opponent through its center, and the smoke recoiled as if in pain. The Reaper reformed, stumbling, holding on to himself in 2 places, blood seeping from between his fingers. This meant that his smoke form didn't erase his injuries, and that Shannon's technique could harm him even in that state. It was a comforting turn of events, to say the least. "You said that you wanted to lay all our cards on the table," Shannon said, beaming with confidence. "That is just one of mine, a technique that I learned from someone very important to me. It's called the Soul Shear, and even though I was never able to use it normally, I was still able to make the technique my own. Now I can make those blades appear for a second or so anywhere within an area charged with my soul. Tell me, Reaper, do you hold any cards that can beat it?" She let her words trail off, and she was surprised by what she heard. It was quiet at first, and growing a bit louder and more sinister with each heartbeat, though it never grew into anything that she would describe as cliché. Either way, it did surprise her that her opponent was laughing at a time like this. Shannon's soul shears disappeared, and as they did, the Reaper turned his shrouded face toward her. He moved his hands from his wounds. Shannon was worried to see that the bleeding had already stopped, that the first wound was already knitting itself messily together behind the hole in the Reaper's shirt, and that the second wound, the one inflicted on him in his smoke form, was gone completely. "And already," the Reaper announced, "you've surprised me again. I can't remember the last time I faced up with someone as powerful as you. I don't know if I ever have. It's strange, it's almost exciting, but the fact of the matter is," he tilted his head back, and the shadow over his face peeled away just enough for Shannon to see his mouth twist into a wicked, toothy smile. "You still don't worry me." He dissolved once again into smoke and rolled across the ground toward Shannon, reforming mid-strike, just in front of her. She sidestepped his attack just in time, but as she did, her opponent twisted midair to face her. She found herself gazing into the darkness where his face would be, and suddenly she could see his eyes. She locked her gaze upon them, and even though they only met for a fraction of a second, it felt like a small eternity, during which Shannon tried to look away, but couldn't. Shannon felt as if those eyes were drills, boring deep into the recesses of her mind, dredging up everything from real and current worries to painful memories of the past that she'd all but forgotten. She somehow knew that the Reaper could see truths about her that even she didn't know herself well enough to see, fears that she wouldn't allow herself to admit to, and then their shared gaze broke. Suddenly, Shannon couldn't remember what the Reaper's eyes even looked like anymore, but the experience still left her shaken. She wasn't able to react in time to avoid her opponent's thrusting heel and was sent flying, crashing into a tree, cracking its trunk a bit before she fell painfully to one knee, bracing herself against the ground. This setback was far from enough to defeat her, though. When it came to fighting, Shannon was a lot like her daughters. She was the kind of fighter who, when she left her opponent an opening, she owned up to that, learned from it, and moved on. All she had to do was avoid his gaze, and he wouldn't be able to use that attack again. She stood up slowly, willing her soul and her life energy to mix, overflowing. The warmth of her new life energy filled her, lessening her pain and restoring her lost stamina. She stepped forward into a loose, ready stance, finally prepared to take her opponent seriously, but as soon as she did, she felt an overwhelming sensation of cold wash over her. Bolts of static danced through the air between her and her opponent, and her instincts kicked in, the two fighters seeming to disappear as they launched themselves at each other with all of their speed, their true heart-to-heart finally beginning.